You ever feel the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, like something's watching you? I thought I'd grown out of that irrational paranoia as a kid. Turns out I was dead wrong. It all started last week. I'm Officer Luke Peterson, and I've been with the department for over 12 years. Usually, the late-night shifts downtown are filled with noise complaints, the occasional bar brawl, or some poor rookie getting spooked by raccoons in alleyways. But this was something else entirely. It was a quiet Tuesday night. No calls for hours. The streets were eerily calm, the kind of calm that wraps around you and feels just wrong. I was parked on the corner of 8th and Maple, sipping the last of my lukewarm coffee, when dispatch came through. We've got a possible break-in at the old Crestwood Apartments. Building's been abandoned for years, but neighbors reported lights inside. Units in the vicinity, please respond. I grabbed the radio. Unit 203 responding. The Crestwood Apartments were a derelict reminder of better days. Peeling paint, boarded-up windows, and rumors of bad things lurking inside. Kids dared each other to go there on Halloween, but none ever came back with stories worth repeating. Even during daylight, the place looked like it belonged in a horror flick. But at 2 a.m., felt like a portal to hell itself. I pulled up, switched off my headlights, and killed the engine. The silence was deafening. No street noise, no rustling leaves, just the oppressive hum of emptiness. Flashlight in hand, I stepped out of the cruiser, boots crunching on the gravel. The air smelled stale, like mold and decay. 203 to dispatch, I'm on scene. Proceeding to investigate. I whispered into my shoulder mic. My voice echoed louder than it should have in the still night. The building loomed ahead, its cracked facade bathed in faint moonlight. As I approached the entrance, my gut twisted. It wasn't just the unease of stepping into an abandoned building. It was something primal, like my instincts were screaming at me to turn back. But cops don't get to listen to their guts. I pushed the door open, the hinges shrieking loud enough to wake the dead. Inside, it was pitch black, save for the faint beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, old newspapers, and the occasional rat scurrying away. The air felt thick, like it had weight. Hello? Police? Anyone here? My voice bounced off the walls, coming back to me distorted. Silence. I moved deeper, my flashlight catching graffiti on the walls. Most of it was the usual nonsense, tags, curses, crude drawings. But one symbol caught my eye, a spiraling design, almost hypnotic, painted in a deep red that looked too fresh to be old. My flashlight's beam lingered on it as a shiver crawled up my spine. A sound broke the stillness, a faint shuffle, like feet dragging against the floor, coming from upstairs. My heart thudded in my chest as I moved toward the stairwell. The steps groaned under my weight, each one threatening to give away my position. As I reached the second floor, the smell hit me, rotting meat, coppery and thick. It clung to my nostrils, making my stomach churn. I pressed on, stepping over a broken door and into the main hallway. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the corridor, bathed in the faint moonlight filtering through a crack in the ceiling, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were observing me. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it toward the figure, and in that split second, it was gone. I froze. This is Officer Peterson. If someone's here, show yourself now. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating. Then, from somewhere deep in the building, I heard it, a slow, deliberate knock. Once, twice, then silence. Knock! Knock! The knocks echoed through the empty building like gunshots. My grip on the flashlight tightened as I forced my legs to move forward. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but pride and protocol kept me going. Police! Whoever's there, come out now! I shouted, my voice bouncing off the walls, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. I followed the sound to a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. The wood was warped and stained with something dark. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I reached for the handle. The metal was icy to the touch, almost burning my skin. I pushed it open. The room was a gutted-out shell of what might have once been an apartment. Exposed brick walls, shattered tiles, and a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling gave it an air of decay. And in the middle of the room there was a chair. It was old, wooden, and covered in deep gouges, as though someone had clawed at it with their bare hands. But that wasn't the worst part. On the floor beneath it was a circle. It wasn't paint or chalk. It was etched into the wood itself. Symbols and runes spiraled inward, intricate and chaotic, pulling the eye toward the center. I didn't recognize them, but they felt wrong. Wrong in a way that made my skin crawl and my breath hitch. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there. A low murmur, like someone speaking just out of reach. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the room. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. The whisper grew louder, though still unintelligible. It wasn't one voice, it was many, layered over each other, clashing and blending into a cacophony that made my head pound. And then it stopped. The silence was so sudden and so complete, it felt like my ears had gone numb. That's when I felt it. Presence. Something was behind me. I turned slowly, the beam of my flashlight trembling as it cut through the air. The chair was no longer empty. A man sat in it now, hunched forward, his head hanging low. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his fingers were long and skeletal, gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles looked ready to break through the skin. "Sir," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you all right?" He didn't move, didn't even flinch. My eyes locked on his face, or what I could see of it. His hair was long, greasy, and hung in stringy clumps, obscuring his features. But then he slowly tilted his head up, and I saw his eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and pitch black. No whites, no pupils, just two voids staring straight into me. A grin stretched across his face, far too wide, exposing yellowed, uneven teeth. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight, and then he stood. It wasn't a normal movement. He didn't push himself up or shift his weight. It was like he was pulled upright by invisible strings, his body jerking unnaturally as he rose to his full height. He towered over me, his head almost brushing the low-hanging bulb. I raised my hand instinctively, reaching for my weapon. "Stay where you are," I shouted, but my voice lacked the authority I was desperate to project. He cocked his head, that grin never faltering. Then, in one fluid motion, he stepped forward. The air around him felt like it shifted, growing heavier, colder. My flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming and brightening in erratic bursts. "Stop! Don't come any closer!" I yelled, fumbling to draw my gun. But the moment my fingers touched the grip, the whispering returned. It was louder now, a chorus of voices overlapping, rising and falling in a maddening rhythm. The words still didn't make sense, but they filled my mind, pushing out every coherent thought. I gritted my teeth, trying to focus. The man, or whatever he was, reached out, his bony fingers outstretched. The whispering crescendoed, each voice screaming in unison, drilling into my skull. I could feel my vision darkening at the edges, my knees threatening to give out. And then, just as his hand was about to touch me, the whispering stopped. The man froze, his grin fading. He cocked his head again, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Without warning, he stepped back into the circle on the floor. His movements were no longer jerky but smooth, almost graceful. The light bulb above him exploded, plunging the room into darkness. My flashlight sputtered once, twice, and then went out completely. I stood there, paralyzed in the pitch black. My breathing was loud and ragged, the only sound in the oppressive silence. And then I heard his voice, clear and distinct, coming from all around me. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. The word "run" echoed in my head like a gunshot. My legs, paralyzed moments before, suddenly came alive, and I bolted out of the room, flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. My heart hammered as I tore down the hallway, my boots slamming against the floor, the sound bouncing back at me like a warped echo. I hit the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to get out of that building, to leave Crestwood Apartments behind and never look back. But as I descended, the air grew heavier, like I was wading through invisible molasses. My breathing grew labored, my lungs burning with each gasp. Then I heard it. Footsteps. But they weren't mine. They were coming from above me, slow and deliberate, each step impossibly loud. I glanced up the stairwell, and my blood ran cold. He was there, at the top of the stairs, silhouetted against the faint moonlight streaming through a broken window. His head tilted to the side, that inhuman grin plastered across his face. And he was descending, not walking, not running, just gliding. His body moved as if he were weightless, floating down the stairs with an eerie grace that defied logic. "Dispatch!" I gasped into my radio, my voice shaking. "Officer Peterson requesting immediate backup at Crestwood Apartments. Code 3. Possible suspect. Armed and dangerous. Static." I pressed the button again, harder this time. "Dispatch, do you copy? I need backup now." Only static replied. I reached the ground floor, bursting out into the main lobby. My flashlight flickered back to life just in time to illuminate the front door. Freedom. Safety. I sprinted toward it, adrenaline surging through my veins. Then the door slammed shut. I skidded to a stop, nearly crashing into the heavy wood. I grabbed the handle, yanking with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like the door was fused to the frame. My flashlight beam danced across the room as I turned to look for another exit. That's when I saw them. Shadows. Dozens of them moving along the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They writhed and twisted, merging and separating, forming shapes that were almost human. Almost. They had no faces, just hollow voids where eyes and mouths should have been. And they were all staring at me. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with a deafening hum. My head throbbed as I stumbled backward, pressing myself against the door. The shadows moved closer, their forms stretching toward me, tendrils of darkness reaching out like claws. "No!" I shouted, raising my flashlight. "Stay back!" The beam cut through the shadows, and for a moment, they recoiled, hissing like animals. But it didn't last. They surged forward, the light barely slowing them down. I felt something cold brush against my arm, and a wave of nausea hit me like a punch to the gut. Then I saw him again. He was standing in the center of the room, completely still. His void-like eyes locked onto mine, his grin impossibly wide. The shadows swirled around him, moving as if they were a part of him, or perhaps he was a part of them. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice echoing in my head, as if it were being spoken directly into my mind. "This place isn't for you." I gripped my flashlight tighter, trying to focus on the beam, on anything other than the suffocating fear threatening to consume me. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised one skeletal hand and pointed at me. The shadows surged forward, a tidal wave of darkness rushing to engulf me. I screamed, raising the flashlight just as the wave hit. And then everything went white. When I opened my eyes, I was sitting on the ground outside the Crestwood Apartments. My cruiser was parked where I'd left it, engine idling. The night was calm again, the oppressive silence replaced by the distant hum of city life. I looked around, disoriented, my heart still racing. My flashlight was gone, my radio crackling softly with static. I climbed to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me, and stumbled toward the cruiser. As I reached for the door handle, I hesitated, glancing back at the building. It was dark, lifeless, just as it had been when I arrived. I got into the cruiser, slamming the door shut, and radioed dispatch. This time they answered. Their voices were calm, routine, as if no time had passed. I didn't tell them what had happened. Couldn't. I didn't even know where to start. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse of the Crestwood Apartments in my rearview mirror. And for a split second, I saw him, standing in the same spot I'd first seen him, staring after me. The grin was gone, but his eyes, Those black voids were still watching. The drive back to the precinct was a blur. The radio hummed with static, the city lights flickered as I passed, and every shadow seemed to reach for the cruiser. My hands were trembling on the wheel, and my mind was racing with questions. What the hell had I just witnessed? When I finally pulled into the station lot, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the dashboard. The usual hum of officers coming and going was comforting, grounding. I needed to talk to someone, maybe Sergeant Myers. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, skeptical of everything, but he'd listen. Stepping into the precinct felt surreal. The fluorescent lights were too bright, the chatter too loud. Everything seemed off. I went straight to Myers' office, rapping on the door before stepping in. "Peterson," he said without looking up, pen scratching on paperwork. "You're back early. Thought you were working the overnight downtown." "I need to talk to you," I said, closing the door behind me. My voice was too quiet, even to my own ears. Something happened. Myers set his pen down and finally looked at me. His sharp green eyes narrowed, taking in my disheveled appearance. "What kind of something?" I took a deep breath and told him everything. The call to Crestwood Apartments, the man in the chair, the shadows, the whispers, the thing that wore a human face but clearly wasn't human. I laid it all out, sparing no detail. When I was done, Myers leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His face was unreadable, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you were chased by what? A ghost? A demon? I don't know," I admitted, frustration bubbling to the surface. "But I'm not making this up, Myers. You know me. I don't spook easy, and I'm not losing it. That place. There's something wrong with it." Myers stared at me for a long moment before finally standing. He walked over to the door, shut it, and turned the blinds to block out the view from the main bullpen. When he turned back to me, his face had changed. He looked tired, resigned. "Luke," he said, his voice lower now, "there's something you need to see." He went to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a thick manila folder. He hesitated for a moment, then tossed it onto the desk in front of me. "This stays between us," he said. I opened the folder. Inside were crime scene photos, police reports, and incident logs. The first photo made my stomach lurch. It was the room I'd been in, with the circle etched into the floor. Only this time, there was blood smeared across the symbols, and a body slumped in the chair. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Crestwood Apartments," Myers said, sitting back down. "The department's been covering up incidents there for decades. Disappearances, murders, things that don't make sense. Every few years, someone goes missing or we find a scene like this, but no suspects. No leads." I flipped through the file, each page more disturbing than the last. There were reports of strange noises, unexplainable lights, and even a few witness accounts describing figures similar to the one I'd seen. One report, dated 1998, detailed an officer who went missing during a routine patrol. The last radio transmission was a single word: "Run." "Why hasn't this been shut down?" I demanded, slamming the folder shut. "Why is this place still standing?" Myers rubbed his temples. "Because whoever's pulling the strings doesn't want it shut down. We've tried. The city declared it condemned years ago, but every attempt to demolish it has been blocked. Zoning issues, funding problems, you name it. And every time we lose someone, it's swept under the rug." I leaned back, the weight of the file pressing down on me like a physical force. "Why didn't I know about this?" Myers' expression darkened. "Because once you know, you're part of it. And believe me, Peterson, you don't want to be part of this." The words hung in the air like a threat. My mind reeled, piecing together the fragments of what I'd seen and what Myers was telling me. The man in the chair, the shadows, the whispers. "What's in that building?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Myers looked at me, his face grim. "Something old. Something that shouldn't be here. And it's not done with you yet." The precinct felt colder when I left Myers' office, like the shadows in the corners had grown teeth. My hands were trembling as I clutched the manila folder, its contents burning a hole in my thoughts. Myers' last words echoed in my mind. "It's not done with you yet." As I sat at my desk, flipping through the reports again, a creeping sense of inevitability washed over me. Crestwood wasn't just a place. It was a predator, and I was its latest prey. My radio crackled to life, snapping me back to reality. "Dispatch to all units, we've got a 10 to 54. Suspicious individual spotted near the Crestwood apartments. Witness reports unusual behavior. Units in the vicinity, please respond." The words froze me in place. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. My first instinct was to ignore it, let someone else take the call. But something deeper, something primal, tugged at me. I had to go back. Grabbing my gear, I headed for the cruiser. Myers' voice rang out behind me. "Peterson, don't you even think about going back there." I didn't respond. Couldn't. If I stopped to think, I'd lose my nerve entirely. The drive back to Crestwood felt shorter this time, though the dread was twice as thick. The streets were deserted, the moonlight muted by an overcast sky. As I pulled up to the building, my headlights caught movement. A figure darted across the lot and into the shadows. 203 to dispatch. I'm on scene, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Investigating suspicious activity. No response. I stepped out of the cruiser, the air biting at my skin. The building loomed ahead, its windows like empty eyes staring down at me. My flashlight cut through the darkness as I approached the front door, which now hung ajar. Inside, the silence was suffocating. The musty air felt heavier, pressing against my chest with every step. The whispers were back, faint but persistent, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of reach. I followed the sound, my flashlight flickering. The beam danced over graffiti, broken furniture, and piles of debris. And then it landed on something new. A series of symbols etched into the wall, the same spirals and runes I'd seen in the circle upstairs. Only now, they were glowing faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. I raised my hand to the radio. "Dispatch, I need backup. There's..." The words caught in my throat as I saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, its back to me. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its head tilted at that unnatural angle. My flashlight flickered violently as I aimed it at the figure. "Stop! Police!" I shouted. It didn't move. I took a cautious step forward. "Turn around. Now." Slowly, it obeyed. The figure's face, or what passed for one, was a featureless void, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to devour the light. As I stared, transfixed, it raised an arm, long and bony, and pointed to the stairs. A single word echoed in my head, not spoken but implanted. "Come." Every step up the stairwell felt heavier than the last, like I was walking through molasses. The whispers grew louder, blending into a low hum that vibrated in my chest. My flashlight's beam sputtered, throwing erratic shadows against the walls. When I reached the second floor, the air was stifling. The door to the room with the circle was wide open, the faint glow of the symbols spilling into the hallway. My pulse quickened as I stepped inside. The chair was back, and so was he. The man sat slumped forward, his greasy hair obscuring his face. The shadows around him writhed, pulsing in time with the glow of the symbols. As I approached, he lifted his head, and those void-like eyes locked onto mine. "You came back," he said, his voice a guttural rasp. "They always do." "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What is this place?" He grinned, his teeth jagged and yellow. "Crestwood isn't a place, officer. It's a doorway, a bridge to the void. And you've seen too much." The shadows surged, wrapping around his form and spreading across the room. My flashlight failed, plunging me into darkness. The whispers became screams, chaotic and overwhelming, filling every corner of my mind. I drew my weapon, firing blindly into the void. The gunshots echoed uselessly, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. "Your light won't save you," the man's voice boomed, reverberating through the room. "But you've been marked, Luke. You'll never leave this behind." Suddenly, the shadows retreated, collapsing inward and taking the man with them. The room was empty, silent. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and bolted out of the building. The air outside felt thin, cold, but free. I jumped into the cruiser, slamming the door and locking it. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the building stood silent, lifeless. But as I stared, I saw something etched into the skin of my forearm. Symbols, faint and glowing, pulsating with the same rhythm as the ones inside. Marked. I drove away, but deep down I knew Myers was right. It wasn't done with me yet. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the first rays of dawn were slicing through the clouds. The golden light felt hollow, a weak defense against the chill that had burrowed into my bones. My house, my sanctuary, didn't feel safe anymore. Not after what I'd seen. Not with the symbols still faintly glowing on my arm. I sat in the cruiser for a long time, staring at my front door, half expecting to see a shadow shift behind the curtains. My mind kept replaying the events at Crestwood, that voice in the darkness, and the chilling promise. You've been marked. When I finally stepped inside, the air felt wrong. It was still my house, but it wasn't. The familiar smell of coffee and wood polish was absent, replaced by something metallic, like blood, and faintly sour. The whispers had followed me home. I couldn't hear them outright, but they were there, curling at the edges of my thoughts. A constant murmur just beyond comprehension. I locked the door and bolted it for good measure. Then I checked every window, every room, every shadow, gun drawn. Nothing was out of place, yet everything felt distorted, like a funhouse reflection of reality. The faint marks on my arm burned with a dull ache, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I didn't sleep that day. The coffee pot became my closest ally as I pored over the file Myers had given me. Crestwood's history was a labyrinth of horror. Murders, disappearances, even suicides by people who had never been inside the building but lived too close to it. One report mentioned a firefighter who'd burned himself alive after responding to a call there. His last words? I brought it home. By late afternoon, exhaustion overtook me. I fell asleep at the kitchen table, my head resting on the manila folder. The dreams came immediately, vivid and suffocating. I was back at Crestwood, standing in that room with the glowing circle. The man in the chair was gone, but the shadows remained, watching. The symbols on the floor pulsed brighter, and as I stepped closer, they began to shift, rearranging themselves like living creatures. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent. Come back. Complete the circle. I woke with a start, gasping for air. My arm was burning now, the symbols glowing brighter than before. I stumbled to the bathroom, flicking on the light, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes looked hollow, sunken, and my skin was pale as a corpse. The marks on my arm were spreading. They crawled up toward my shoulder, faint etchings resembling the same spirals and runes from Crestwood. I scrubbed at them furiously, but it was like trying to wash off a tattoo. They didn't budge. The whispers grew louder. That night, the real nightmare began. It started with the lights flickering. I was in the living room trying to convince myself I could figure this out, solve this thing before it consumed me. But the lights dimmed and surged erratically, the shadows in the corners deepening with each flicker. Then the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged the air as the house grew unnaturally cold. The whispers were everywhere now, filling the room, overlapping and chaotic. I could feel them crawling inside my skull, scratching at the edges of my sanity. And then, the shadows moved. They crept along the walls, slithering toward me like living things. I grabbed my flashlight, but the beam only seemed to make them stronger, their shapes twisting and contorting in ways that made my stomach churn. Show yourself, I shouted, my voice cracking. The shadows stopped, pooling together in the center of the room. They rose, forming a shape, a man. The same man from Crestwood, his void-like eyes locking onto mine. You can't run, he said, his voice reverberating through the room. The mark is your bond. You belong to us now. I raised my gun, aiming at his chest. Get out of my house. He tilted his head, that awful grin stretching across his face. "This isn't your house anymore, Luke. It's ours." The shadows surged toward me, a tidal wave of darkness swallowing the room. I fired blindly, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the inky void, but it was useless. The darkness consumed everything, and I felt cold tendrils wrapping around my arms, my legs, my throat. And then, nothing. I woke on the floor, gasping for air. The lights were back on, the house was warm again, and the whispers were gone. But the marks on my arm had spread further, now reaching my neck. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from an unknown number. "Come back. Finish it." I stared at the message, my blood running cold. My instincts screamed to ignore it, to run, to leave the city if I had to. But I knew that wouldn't help. Crestwood had marked me, and until I confronted whatever was waiting there, it wouldn't stop. My gun felt heavier than ever as I picked it up and holstered it. The next time I walked into Crestwood, I wouldn't be walking out. The drive back to Crestwood was the longest of my life. Each second felt stretched, drawn out by the weight of the inevitability ahead. The city blurred around me, its familiar streets now alien, tinged with the oppressive presence of whatever had marked me. The text replayed in my mind like a mantra. "Come back. Finish it." The whispering had returned, faint and insidious, threading itself through my thoughts. It wasn't just noise, it was purpose. Each voice seemed to pull me closer to the answer, closer to Crestwood. I knew this was insanity, yet I couldn't stop. As I pulled into the lot, I killed the engine and stared at the hulking shadow of the building. The night was unnaturally still, the air heavy with the same metallic tang I'd smelled in my house. The marks on my arm pulsed faintly, the glow reflecting off the dashboard. This time, the front door wasn't ajar. It stood wide open like an invitation. I stepped out of the cruiser, my boots crunching against the gravel, and drew my flashlight and sidearm. The air pressed down on me with every step, each one feeling harder than the last. By the time I crossed the threshold, the light from outside seemed to vanish, swallowed by the oppressive darkness within. The interior was worse than before. The building felt alive, breathing, the walls shifting almost imperceptibly. The glowing symbols were everywhere now, etched into the floors, the ceilings, pulsating in time with the marks on my arm. I moved cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, revealing shadows that seemed to dance just out of reach. The whispers grew louder, no longer hiding at the edges of my perception. They filled the space, overlapping, chaotic, pulling me deeper. The stairwell loomed ahead, the rusted metal steps leading to the second floor. I hesitated at the base, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Something moved in the shadows above, slow, deliberate. The faint creak of footsteps echoed down to me. Taking a deep breath, I climbed the stairs, my boots scraping against the metal, each step a battle against the instinct to run. When I reached the second floor, the hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, the glowing symbols bathing everything in an eerie light. At the far end stood the door to the room with the circle. It was open, a faint glow spilling into the hallway. The man's voice echoed in my head as I approached, low and mocking. "You're almost there, Luke. So close." The marks on my arm burned as I stepped into the room. The circle was different now. The symbols weren't just glowing, they were moving, shifting in intricate patterns that seemed to defy logic. The air inside the room was thick, vibrating with an energy that made my teeth ache. And in the center of it all, he stood. The man, if he could even be called that, was waiting for me. His void-like eyes locked onto mine, his grin as wide and unsettling as ever. But now, his form was less human. The shadows writhed around him, blending with his body, warping it into something monstrous. "You came back," he said, his voice reverberating through the room. "Good. Now we can begin. What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay steady. "Why me?" He chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "It's not about you, Officer Peterson. It's about the mark, the bridge. You were chosen to carry it, to finish what others could not. My grip on the flashlight tightened. Chosen by who? By them, he said, gesturing to the circle. The symbols flared brighter, the room filling with blinding light. The whispers reached a fever pitch, screaming in unison. And then I saw them, figures, dozens of them, standing at the edges of the room, their forms made entirely of shadows. They had no faces, but I could feel their eyes on me, their presence pressing down like a weight on my chest. The man stepped closer, his grin stretching impossibly wide. The bridge must open, Luke, and you will help us. Before I could react, the shadows surged toward me, wrapping around my body like a suffocating shroud. My flashlight fell from my hand, clattering to the floor, its beam extinguished. The marks on my arm burned with searing intensity as the whispers became deafening. And then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the circle. The room was empty now, the man and the shadowy figures gone. The symbols on the floor had stopped moving, their glow fading into darkness. My arms felt heavy, and when I looked down, I saw that the marks had spread across my chest, pulsing faintly. I stumbled out of the room, down the hallway, and out of the building. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and biting. My cruiser was still there, waiting like nothing had happened. As I drove away, my mind raced. The whispers were gone, but their presence lingered, a phantom weight pressing against my thoughts. The marks on my body weren't just symbols, they were a promise. The bridge had been opened, and I wasn't sure if I was the one who crossed it, or if something had crossed over into me. The room was waiting for me. When I stepped inside, it was no longer the decrepit apartment I had seen before. It was a cathedral of shadows, the walls pulsating with a sickly light. The chair was gone, replaced by the glowing circle etched into the floor. Symbols spiraled outward, their patterns writhing and shifting like living things. And in the center of it all stood the man. His form was more defined now, his features sharp but wrong, as though someone had sculpted a human from broken memories. His void-like eyes locked onto mine, and that awful grin stretched wider than ever. "You returned," he said, his voice reverberating through the room. "Good. The circle is incomplete without its final piece. What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Why me?" He tilted his head, the shadows around him writhing in unison. "Crestwood is not a building, Luke. It's a threshold, a bridge between worlds. And you are the key." I raised my gun, aiming at his chest. "Stay back." He chuckled, the sound low and guttural. "Guns won't save you, officer, but you already know that." The symbols on the floor flared brighter, their light blinding. The air vibrated, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar. The shadows surged, wrapping around my legs and pulling me toward the circle. I fired, emptying the clip into his chest. The bullets passed through him like smoke, embedding themselves in the wall behind. He stepped closer, his grin splitting his face. "You've already crossed the threshold, Luke. The mark ensures it." The shadows pulled harder, dragging me into the center of the circle. My flashlight fell from my hand, clattering to the floor as the light extinguished. Darkness consumed everything, and the whispers transformed into screams, voices of anguish and despair, begging for release. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But it didn't come. When I opened my eyes, I was back outside, standing in the lot. The building was gone. The spot where Crestwood had stood was an empty patch of scorched earth, the air above it shimmering like heat waves. I looked down at my arm. The marks were fading, the glow dimming until they disappeared entirely. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence. It was over, or so I thought.